Today, we're diving into the Oslo Accords. It was this moment in the 1990s that felt like one of the biggest, most hopeful pushes for peace in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It all started with this incredible sense of possibility, but it ultimately unraveled, leaving behind a really complicated and painful legacy.
It all led to this iconic moment on the White House lawn. You have two sworn enemies shaking hands, a deal that would go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And yet, less than a decade later, the whole region just erupted in a new and terrible way of violence. So that brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. What on earth went wrong? To really get why this peace process felt so urgent, so necessary, we have to rewind a bit. We have to look at the conflict that came right before it. The story really kicks off with a popular uprising that completely changed the game. This uprising became known as the First Intifada. Now, that word, intifada, it literally means shaking off in Arabic. And honestly, that just perfectly captures the feeling of what it was. A massive Palestinian movement that kicked off in late 1987, all aimed at, well, shaking off decades of Israeli military rule. You know, this uprising didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The pressure had been building for 20 long years under military occupation. You had the slow, steady expansion of Israeli settlements on what was Palestinian land. You had an economy where tons of Palestinians were totally dependent on Israel for low-wage jobs. And with unemployment in Gaza hitting a crazy 35%, daily life for so many people was just steeped in this deep sense of frustration and humiliation. All that simmering anger just needed a spark. And on December 9th, 1987, it got one. An Israeli military vehicle crashed into a truck that was carrying Palestinian laborers in Gaza, and 4 of them were killed. You know, whether it was an accident or not almost didn't matter to the people on the ground. It was seen as just one more brutal act, and it ignited protests that spread like wildfire across Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And the Israeli response? It was harsh. As young people were throwing stones and Molotov cocktails, Israeli forces often used live ammunition. In just the first 2 years of the Intifada, 759 Palestinians were killed. It's a number that really just speaks for itself about the staggering human cost of this uprising. And yet, out of this really vicious cycle of violence, something totally unexpected started to happen. A surprising diplomatic path began to emerge, a secret path to peace that almost nobody saw coming. So, while the whole world was glued to their TVs watching these clashes, something remarkable was happening in total secret. The government of Norway, which was seen as an ally to Israel but also as trustworthy by the PLO, started hosting these clandestine talks. And to keep it all off the radar, they were disguised as academic dialogues. It was a clever way to let officials from both sides finally meet face to face. And the result was the 1993 Oslo Accord. Now, this wasn't a final peace treaty. Not by a long shot. Think of it more like a roadmap. Step 1 was mutual recognition. I mean, this was huge. The PLO and Israel formally recognized each other. Step 2 created the Palestinian Authority, the PA, to start handling self-governance. Step 3 laid out a phased Israeli military withdrawal. And really crucially, Step 4 set a 5-year deadline to figure out all the hardest stuff: Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, and the final border. And at first, people were on board, big time. Polls showed 65% of Israelis and around 70% of Palestinians supported the deal. Yeah, there was some pretty vocal opposition, but for a moment there, it really felt like a genuine breakthrough had happened. This whole wave of optimism really culminated in the 1994 Nobel Peace Prize, which was awarded to the 3 main architects of the deal: Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat. This was it. This was the absolute peak of international hope for peace in the region. But, and this is where the story really takes a turn, beneath the surface of that handshake and the Nobel Prize, the peace process itself had some deep and what many critics would later call fatal flaws built right into it. To get at one of the biggest criticisms, we need to talk about this term, Bantustan. It comes from apartheid-era South Africa, and it refers to these territories that were supposed to be self-governing. But in reality, they were fragmented, they were disconnected, and they were totally economically dependent on the ruling power. Critics, most famously the brilliant scholar Edward Said, started using this exact term to describe what they saw unfolding in Palestine. And this table is exactly why that term was used. The next agreement, also too in 1995, basically carved up the West Bank into this patchwork of control. You have Area A under full Palestinian control, which at first only covered the main cities, like a bunch of disconnected islands. Then Area B, which was a mix of Palestinian civil control but Israeli security control. But the real key was Area C, a full 60% of the West Bank, which had most of the open land, the resources, and all the Israeli settlements. It stayed under complete Israeli control, which made a viable, connected future Palestinian state incredibly difficult to even imagine. So you've got this fragmented map, and that became the backdrop for a series of absolutely devastating events that caused the entire process to just unravel with shocking speed.
The timeline of this decay was just terrifyingly fast. In 1994, an Israeli settler massacred 29 Palestinians while they were praying in a mosque in Hebron. In response, the militant group Hamas began a brutal campaign of suicide bombings against Israeli civilians. Then, in November of 95, Prime Minister Rabin, the Israeli champion of the peace process, was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli extremist. The shock of that was followed just 6 months later by the election of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was a staunch opponent of the Oslo Accords. You could just feel trust collapsing on all sides.
And get this, while all this chaos was unfolding, one of the biggest issues that was supposed to be solved in those final talks, Israeli settlements, was actually accelerating. The agreement said neither side should do anything to change the status of the territories, but on the ground, the opposite was happening. In just 3 years after Oslo I, the Jewish settler population grew by nearly 50% in the West Bank and over 60% in Gaza. The final, high-stakes attempt to save this whole thing came in the summer of 2000. President Bill Clinton brought Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to Camp David for this marathon summit. But after 2 grueling weeks, the talks completely collapsed. They just could not agree on those core issues that they had kicked down the road all those years ago: Jerusalem, Palestinian refugees, and the final borders. The Oslo process was, for all intents and purposes, dead. So why? Why did it all fall apart? Well, there's no simple answer, but looking back, analysts usually point to this toxic mix of a flawed framework, a series of broken promises, and just a complete and total breakdown of trust. For historian Ilan Pappé, the problem was baked into the agreement from the very beginning. He argues the accords were dominated by Israel's interests from the start. They crucially ignored the issue of Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war, and on top of that, he says they were actively violated by Israel through that continued settlement expansion. Another historian, Avi Schleim, takes that argument even further. He claims the accords just became a cover for colonialism. In his view, the collapse was fundamentally rooted in what he calls Israel's bad faith, especially after Netanyahu was elected. He argues that government simply had no intention of ever allowing a truly viable Palestinian state to come into being. Now, Harvard scholar Sarah Roy offers a more nuanced view, arguing that the blame is really shared. She points to the frequent Israeli closures of the territories, which created massive economic despair for Palestinians. But she also critiques Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Authority, which she argues became corrupt and ultimately failed its own people, leading to this collective disillusionment with their own leadership. But maybe the most prophetic and chilling critique came from Edward Said. Remember that word, Bantustan? He was writing this way back in 1995. Arguing that the accords were not a path to peace at all, but a direct path to the Bantustanization of Palestine, a process not designed to end the occupation, but to make it more cost-effective by having Palestinians police themselves in these disconnected territories. Ultimately, the failure of Oslo wasn't about one single event. It was a perfect storm. You had a flawed framework, escalating violence from both sides, a profound lack of trust, and concrete actions on the ground that just made the goal of 2 states seem impossible. The Oslo Accords are history now, but the questions they raise about power, about justice, and about what it truly takes to make peace, they remain as relevant as ever. And it leaves us with this final thought. What are the lessons we can learn from a process that promised so much, and yet, in the end, delivered so little?